Christmas, happy Kwanzaa, happy Hanukkah, happy winter solstice, happy Festivus, happy holidays. This is Superheroes in Color, the podcast about Black comic book characters and their reflection in history and culture. I'm your host, Wesley Hall, and as always, I'm joined by fellow comic enthusiast Morris Gardner, who is a research librarian at the Auburn Avenue Research Library here in Atlanta, Georgia. Morris, how's it going today? Season's greetings.
I'm good, man. Same to you, man.
Good. Welcome aboard. Let's just jump right into it then. Now, in a previous episode of Superheroes in Color, if you remember back, we talked about the impact of the Black Panther on the comic universe and on culture as a whole. But in this episode, we're focusing on Luke Cage, who is a character that, personally, I consider him equally, if not even a little more iconic than Black Panther. We'll talk about some of those reasons as we get started. But I want to jump right in and start with a little backstory about Luke Cage. And then, Morris, we'll just get into it and dig down into some of the history, the impact, the influence that Luke Cage has had on the Black comic verse.
That's what's up.
All right. So let's start with a little intro about Luke Cage. And Luke Cage was written by Archie Goodwin, and he was edited, of course, by Stan Lee. But he had help from that with a guy named Roy Thomas, who worked on the Avengers and on the Uncanny X-Men. Goodwin was the original writer of the Iron Man series. So he came in with a lot of comic cred already. He also, I think he was a pioneer in bringing in marginalized groups, let's say, and bringing in minority groups. He actually created Rachel Van Helsing, who was a vampire hunter in the Tomb of Dracula series. And he also created the first Spider-Woman. So he had a little bit of cred coming into this, even dealing with minority groups. But of course, you know about Luke Cage, right? He has superhuman strength. He has an unbreakable skin. He has that accelerated healing. So it's really hard to touch him, right? But Luke Cage, just to give you a little bit of backstory again, he was drawn by a guy named George Tuska. And George Tuska had some help from John Romita, who is famous for starting the Amazing Spider-Man, the first Spider-Man. And the first appearance of Luke Cage, and this is, I think, one of the most important things to understand about Luke Cage, is his first appearance was in Hero for Hire #1, Luke Cage, Hero for Hire #1, which is June of 1972. Luke Cage was actually the first Black superhero to have his own series, his own flagship title. So there were other, of course, Black Panther came a little bit before Luke Cage, but he started, if you think back, he started in Fantastic Four, then moved on to Jungle Action, right? He didn't get his own title until after Luke Cage. So Luke Cage kind of paved the way for Black superheroes to have their own title in 72. Of course, he also appeared in other comics alongside other people that we're going to talk about in a minute. But Luke Cage was the idea. And Mars, when you told me, when you contacted me and said, let's do this about Luke Cage, I was so excited for those reasons. But for one more big reason, because it ties into the theme of our season, right? In that Luke Cage's his catchphrase was "Sweet Christmas," and that's what this episode is all about: Sweet Christmas and Luke Cage. So, first of all, thank you for that great idea. And what kind of sparked you? What triggered in your mind to that catchphrase, "Sweet Christmas"? How'd you come by the idea for us to kick off this episode?
Yeah, let me put something out there. Really, Dr. Jonathan Gales at Georgia State has done an amazing documentary called White Scripts, Black Superman.
Nice.
And it really delves into a lot of the stuff that we talk about. And so he did an amazing lecture that I've heard a couple of times about Luke Cage. And one of the things he kind of focuses on in the lecture is that "Sweet Christmas" catchphrase. And because it seems so out of place, it's really corny. It's really, kind of
yes.
Nowhere in the culture do you felt like that was pulled from, that kind of thing. And so it kind of reflects that image of where Luke Cage was created. And I think it's a really nice vantage point to start talking about the fact that Luke Cage was created right in that Black exploitation film era, that kind of thing. And that catchphrase just really always stuck as like the main thing. Because I even remember reading it as a kid looking at it and being like, that's corny. You know, that's really, really corny. So
Yes.
that has always stuck with me. And with us coming into our December thing, I was like, yeah, we need to kick that off with, you know, just examining Sweet Christmas and just kind of moving on from that. Because you'll see it's his thing, man. I think it even goes from the original book all the way into, I believe, the Netflix series. I believe they carry, I believe the character in the Netflix series carried it through. So it's a theme that stayed with it. And I was just curious, like, to explore it and start to look at, you know, the different angles as to, you know, from that catchphrase, really examine the whole creation of Luke Cage, why he's important, why he's iconic, but then also trouble it, you know, as well, in terms of how he was created. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And to give a little bit more of that historical context, Brian Cronin, he writes for a site called CBR.com. He actually did a look back to the actual origins of that catchphrase itself. And the first time he said it, just like you said, was in that original run of Luke Cage. Actually, it appeared in 1975. And we're going to talk about the different titles that Luke Cage went through in kind of his evolution. But one of those titles was Powerman, of course. And in the number 27 issue in 1975 was the first time he actually said that phrase, which is interesting that you say it because it is super corny, just like you said. But prior to that, his catchphrase was "sweet sister." So he used, when he would, you know, see something or get into something or he'd throw a punch or catch a punch, he would say "sweet sister." And then that kind of, according to Brian Cronin, and you can see his kind of anthology is really interesting to look because he captures the panels in which this happens. He went from "sweet sister" to "just sister," and then to Christmas. And then in 75, we went to "Sweet Christmas."
Yeah.
He never lost his corniness, just like you said.
Yeah.
That was a little bit of evolution of that.
I got one note on that too, man. And one of the things when I was doing some of the background research and whatnot, that I think I have no documentation that this is connected at all, but it's just interesting to me that, you know, out of the Black exploitation film genre, it really kicked off in 71 with Mario Van Peebles' Sweet Back Badass Song. And that was 1971. And so I don't know if there was some kind of connection that they saw the film, because it became a very popular film at the time. And so I don't know if they tried to just pull that and just stick it into the Cage, you know, a lexicon or whatnot. But when I was doing some research, I was like, well, that's funny that this film came out in 71. So maybe that's where they pull it from. But it totally did not come from the culture. We know that for sure.
Definitely did not come from the culture.
There was no brothers that you were saying that at all. So
that's great. I do want to stay with that whole blaxploitation theme that you brought up, because like we said, the first issue, Luke Cage's origin issue, and by the way, of all the origin issues that I have ever read, Luke Cage #1 is among the top. It's probably top 3, right? The way that this story kind of developed and unfolded was amazing to me, to see that writing style. And we're going to get into some of the catches, you know, some of the stereotypical things that's going to come along with blaxploitation, because I do want you to take us a little bit through that era, Morris, especially from historical context. But I just have to put out there that I enjoyed that particular, and it sticks out in my mind as one of the better origins that I've ever seen. So in 72, Luke Cage, that #1 started. And actually from 72 to February of 74, Luke Cage, Hero for Hire was the cover title. And then Luke Cage, and we're going to talk about how we got here. Luke Cage in February 74, in number 17, moved to the Powerman title. And then about issue number 48, I think it was December 1977, Powerman met up with Iron Fist, right? And then we got the Powerman and Iron Fist series that went from 77 forward for quite a while. But before we get out of the 70s, like I said, I want to dive back into that whole blaxploitation era, because I have some thoughts about it. But first of all, I just want to step back and Morris, will you frame blaxploitation for us in terms of what that meant in the 70s, what that meant in pop culture? What is blaxploitation all about?
Yeah, so when you look at, there's a group of films that were made right at the early to mid 70s that featured Black actors, and it was a clear effort by the movie industry to attract urban Black audiences, right? And so it was a dual kind of thing, because the response to when these films came out, and we're talking about Mario Van Peebles' Sweetback Badass Song, Superfly, Shaft, you know, really some iconic Black cinema. But at that exact same time that those films are coming out, one thing about the actual term Black exploitation, Junius Griffin, he was the president of the Beverly Hills chapter of the National Association of Advancement of Colored People. He actually is credited for coining the term Black exploitation. And when he coined it, it was a negative statement on the films that were coming out, because what he saw was, which is of course in those films, there was the glorification of pimp culture, the glorification of drugs and things of that nature. But at the same time, these films were taking the Black experience in cinema out of the mammy, the enslavement, those narratives that had dominated Black presence, you know, the servant kind of thing, and actually had this kind of empowered statement that these Black characters in cinema were driving, you know, their own lives, had agency, and were moving forward. And so that was there was a dual thing happening. There was a lot of people in the community, a lot of people in the academic community that looked at these films as the starting point for some of the things that we see in hip hop now, the glorification of, you know, certain kinds of violence, and definitely misogyny was a huge part of, you know, these films as well. And Luke Cage's comic sits right in the middle of that, right in the middle of that conversation. So I think it's really good to position that within that cinema experience, because what Marvel always has done when they were looking to expand audiences, they always tried to stay current with those issues. And I think this is where we've had conversations about the Black Panther, and saw it kind of birth out of Marvel's effort to, you know, expand their audiences and sell more comics.
100%. And if you even look at some of the artwork in, especially those first issues of Luke Cage, you will definitely see that Blaxploitation theme. I mean, the first issue and that artwork in it looks like, to me, a lot of the movie posters that you would even see from Dolomite and from those guys Dolomite. that you mentioned. And Blackula was a big, I don't know. That was one of the big ones too. But I remember that era, like you said, a lot of, even though there was a lot of empowerment in that era, there was a lot of stereotypes that were brought forward too, right? And Dolomite was, and I have to admit, during that time, I was a little kid, a younger kid then, wasn't even supposed to, you know, have access to Rudy Ray Moore and those type of guys. But I was, the way Rudy Ray Moore, you know, the way he rhymed and did the signified monkey and all that kind of stuff. If you're familiar with any of that, you have to think back to those eras, man, playing the dozens and rhyming when you talked. All of that was like the Black experience, right? And so you're right, that Blaxploitation era, it was kind of a double-edged sword then, and Luke Cage definitely played on that. You know, if you think back, Stan Lee to me is a lot like, Stan Lee is like the Norman Lear of the comic book world. And Norman Lear, if you know, a TV kid like I was, Norman Lear brought out shows like Good Times, and he brought out the Jeffersons. He was a director in those. And what Stan Lee and those guys did, and I think it's real important to bring out that a lot of these writers, both from the sitcom world and the comic book world, a lot of those actors, we tend to look at those as quote unquote white writers, but a lot of those guys were actually Jewish in origin, right? So you had this culture that had some, like we said before, when you and I talked, Morris, right? They had some reference to being marginalized. And I think they were trying to bring forth what they saw in maybe the Black community, you know? So Norman Lear, the way he brought the Jeffersons, the way he brought Good Times, and the way he even brought All in the Family. You remember Archie Bunker and all those guys. That thing has a real parallel to me in the way that, you know, Stan Lee and Goodwin and even John Romita and all these guys treated Black characters back in those days. So I think there was a theme that underlied like both of those mediums.
Yeah, and I think the thing was, it had that dual kind of thing where it gave voice to a certain Black experience, but then we still didn't have that authentic own voices where we had the Black writers in those rooms to enhance it. But then you also see, like with those films too, there was a level that the James Evans character in Good Time, you know, it became that there became pushback about, you know, what this Black body should represent in the film. Exactly. And I think that's the same thing with the evolution with Luke Cage as well, which we'll get into, you know, as we go further on. Yes. But these are like the very starts of what that imagery starts to look like. But I like the fact that you brought up the fact, like the comic, that initial comic, I remember getting it and being a kid in the 70s, and it fit right into the zeitgeist of everything that was happening right there. It was just like, it just fit everything. And you know, when you go back on your second reads, then you start to trouble it. Then you start to trouble, like, why is he shackled? You know, why are chains so important to Luke Cage's aesthetic? You know, from the belt to the cuffs on the wrist and that kind of thing. The open shirt. I mean, you know, there's just so much there. Just not even getting into the context of the storylines, but just visually, when you start to trouble it, man, it really becomes problematic.
Yeah, now I definitely want to look at some more of the visual aspects, because I think a lot of the dialogue in the comic, of course, that dialogue is very important, but I think that's you brought out the other big thing that I want to spend some time as we go along, is the visual aspects and how Luke Cage came across. Because, you know, it's like they say about food, you feast with your eyes first, right? So the first thing I have is that visual perception. And I think that set the tone for a lot of things in Luke Cage. So let's do this. Let me give you a real quick rundown of how we got Luke Cage in the Marvel universe, and then we'll just kind of run through some of our points about it. So, of course, Luke Cage, like many superheroes, Luke Cage was he got his superpowers as a product of an experiment. And we absolutely, I think Morris and I will agree that you need to read this origin story, if anything else. So through a series of events, Luke Cage ends up falsely accused and going to jail. And it's really important how he even got to that point, because you know, Goodwin treated him like most stereotypical characters from that time. Luke started out, you know, running with gangs. He started out, and his game was Carl Lucas, by the way, when he first started, before he became a superhero. He was Carl Lucas, running with a gang and getting into trouble, and then decides that he doesn't want to do that life anymore and starts to try to better himself. Gets framed, goes to jail. In jail, he has all kind of problems, especially from not only from other inmates, but from a super racist what do you call it, Morris? I guess a jail, you call it a jailer,
the guard,
the guard, the jail guard, a super racist jail guard. And it's interesting, and Morris, you may remember some of that dialogue. Godwin was really crafty in the way he used language, especially from those racist guards in jail, and the words that he used, because they call Luke Cage boy a lot, right? Which was which was a trigger word back then.
Oh yeah.
But he stopped short of using really strong. You would see him say "why you" and then ... And you know, your mind had
you can feel those.
Yeah. But we stopped short of going too far in the actual dialogue.
Yeah.
Right. But in jail, he gets a chance to be paroled by participating in an experiment. All right. And this experiment is by a doctor who's doing an experiment on cell regeneration, if I remember the term correctly. And what's interesting, Morris, about the experiment was the doctor tell Luke Cage that it's funded by Stark Industries. Right. So we get into and of course, he goes into this radiation bath, right, where he's supposed to be testing him, and the racist jail guard walks in and sees Luke Cage in this radiation bath, and he hates him, so he turns it up and tries to kill him, and he gets his superpowers. That's how it goes. So he goes back into, and this is where it gets interesting, Mars. This is where I want to get your kind of input and see what you think about this, because as a profession, I work in marketing, and I find it really interesting how Luke Cage, when he breaks out of jail because he has a superpower, he goes back and he decides, now I'm going to take this superpower. But his initial thing about his superpower is, I am not trying to be necessarily a force for good. I need to eat, right? Because I just broke out of jail. I got no money. I got to find something to do. So what he starts to do is market himself. And that's where the whole hero for hire thing comes out. And he takes on the Luke Cage moniker. But here's where that visual part, Morris, and here's what I want to get your input. Here's where it comes. He decides that to market himself, he needs to do a couple of things. He needs to go out and get some interest for himself, go out and do a couple of things to get some talk, and he gets some business cards made with Hero for Hire. Right. But the other important thing is he goes to he literally says, I'm going to go to a costume shop and get a costume that will be befitting him, right? That will give him his marketing edge. And then we get into the whole, like you said, the whole shirt open, the whole layout. Now, so my whole point in getting to the visuals is once now we got this superhero that's developed, Morris, right? We have the opportunity as, you know, the artist and Goodwin and the writers, all this. We have an opportunity right now to decide what Luke Cage is going to look like, because he's at the comic shop about to get his superhero costume.
Right.
What drives that thought now? What says, here's how we're going to make Luke Cage look? Is it, you know, as Goodwin and the artists that are working on Luke Cage, is it their perception of what Black culture is? Is it media perception of what Black culture is? How do we decide what Luke Cage is going to look like with the chains and the belt and all that?
Yeah, I think it starts off from a marginalized standpoint too.
Yes.
Even within his in prison experience and getting, because you don't see like him go to trial. You don't see like the structure that puts Luke Cage in prison. You just kind of see he gets caught up, framed, and then next thing you see him. But it never talks about the structure of that as a racist structure or that kind of thing. So that was the element that was missing. That it wasn't just that individual prison guard that was against Cage, but there was this kind of overall structure, which, you know, speaks to some definite scholarship that comes out, you know, New Jim Crow, or books that, you know, just tie in lovely to this. But I think it's because of what was happening in the community at the time, particularly, like I said, with the Black exploitation films and that culture of this was the dominant visual aesthetic of Black masculinity with the shafts and things like that. And I think that's what actually framed what he actually looked like. Had you had like African Americans in the space to help cultivate that image, you still might have had that same thread or that same storyline. Because I'm not troubled by that story. I mean, that's the Count of Monte Cristo. There's a lot of storylines that you know, get somebody, you know, imprisoned unjustly and they fight their way out. But I think you've hit on really the key point that shifts it in terms of to become a problematic issue, and particularly with his aesthetic and him coming out is definitely influenced by what Black masculinity looks like. And even the way they draw Cage, there's a real kind of proportional difference in terms of his muscularity and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of troubling images that come out of that. But I think you hit on when he has to pick his costume and he actually picks that, there's nothing noble about it. There's nothing morally, you know, hey, this is how I want to represent. It's like if Captain America came out and was like, oh, how do I, you know, oh, I'm gonna go and get a cowboy outfit. That's right. You know, same kind of thing, you know, but he came out with an aesthetic. And that's an important thing about your origin story. You know, when you find that look, how you gonna be in a community, that's an important aspect of it. So I think you hit on it. I think it is that influence of the cinema that was happening at the time, but also that kind of going back to like Good Times, for example, how JJ was in Good Times. He had a catchphrase, dynamite. That kind of stuff was funny because it didn't fit within the culture. I didn't know anybody that acted like JJ all the time. You know, it's the same kind of thing where that's where they dropped the ball. As writers and creators, they couldn't turn that corner without having the Black community involved in it.
Yeah, and that's such a good point because just like you said, me either. I didn't know anybody that acted like JJ, right? That went around and shouted dynamite and made it rhyme that type. But here's the thing is we knew better. My whole, and the visual, the whole thing that's so important to bring out about this, Morris, is that you and I knew better, right? We knew that wasn't visually representing us. We knew that there was nobody walking around strutting like JJ. However, people outside of our culture, and I dare say maybe even a few people in our culture didn't have that same recognition. And that's what's troubling about me. Literally people, and you think back, you remember that movie Soul Man that came out. Yeah. You remember when they were sitting there, when the Ray Don Chong's character brought that guy home, everybody at the table, when they were sitting around the table, if you remember that scene, it was so like powerful to me that it still sticks with me, because they went around the table, the mom, the dad, and the son were sitting at the table. Everybody at that table saw something different when they looked over at him as a black guy. But they all saw something very stereotypical about it, right? So I agree with you that we didn't have anybody that was walking around that was clapping and shouting dynamite. But I dare say the troubling part about that is a lot of other cultures, and even some people inside of our culture, did think that was a black experience.
You talking about the golden age of television too, where all of a sudden Americans are sitting around in mass. Roots has come out during the 70s, and so you start to see that there's this expression of black culture on television, and people are like in huge numbers watching these images and that kind of thing. And so that's developing in the consciousness, and so I think that reflects, how his costume and what he was going to look like aesthetically came out. There was a lot of stuff that was in the culture that just kind of narrowed him to, he couldn't be anything else but
that. Exactly.
That great, and that's the problem with it, right?
Yeah, that definitely is. And before we transition out of the 70s and that whole blaxploitation era, because we're going to go to the 80s next, one thing that I think is important to bring out is some of the protagonists in some of the issue that ran through the 70s, because in that blaxploitation era, Morris, what was always funny to me as I look back is everything, not everything, but most things to be in that blaxploitation era, you had to weave the term black into your title, right? Because you had Black Goliath back then as a comic book character. Blackula was the Black Dracula, that came out of the movie. But there was a character also that Luke Cage went against called Black Mariah. And I don't know if you remember her character, but she was almost a kind of Mom's Mabley looking character, real heavy set.
Even her dress was like that print from the, she had the big
That's
dress.
Right. That's right. Exactly. 100% right. So I think that one of the things that you and I talk about all the time is how important representation is. And I think when you have other cultures depicting you run into some of these traps, because you have to depict what you think and what you think right? And I think a lot of that is a result.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. And I think that's a great expansion into the universe, that his universe carried those same tropes. Once they established Luke within this box, even the universe couldn't expand outside of that. So it stayed within, even the villains that he had to fight, even the things that he would fight over were problematic sometimes, because there was no at that point, hero established that was really working to keep his lights on. And really, there were much more noble causes that Superman and Captain America were engaged in, saving universes, saving populations. And I think you couldn't have that without the community engaged in cultivating that, because you can't know it. You can't understand, where storylines could go and how villains could be, depicted without a real strong understanding from people from the inside of the community. And that's why you get these stereotypes and like you said, the villains that came out, and you also get that kind of easy, let's just make it Blackula and it's a Black Dracula. You know what I'm saying? That's kind of an easy.
That's a layup,
way
man.
Out. Yeah, that's an easy way out.
Yes.
And it wasn't rooted in any. That's one thing that with Luke Cage too. It wasn't rooted in the culture. It didn't have those connections that brought forth a lot of what could have been a really rich conversation, even with him coming out of prison. We're talking about the 70s. So we're talking about the Attica riots. We're talking about, a lot of prison reform issues because of what's happening, in incarceration. And so there's conversations there that aren't even being dealt with that definitely laid fertile ground for what that narrative looked like. But the thing with his villains and the people that he fought against, man, it just expanded the universe in a very kind of, stereotypical way that didn't truly reflect the breadth and scope of the Black community.
100% agree. And so what happens is there is another title that Marvel had at the time, Iron Fist. As the 70s progressed and we move into the 80s, Luke Cage's popularity, that comic started to wane a little bit. And Iron Fist, which had its own storyline and its own probably, following at that time, that comic title started, in terms of sales, started to wane as well. So what the brilliant writers at Marvel did is decide to join these two kind of fledgling storylines together into one. And we get Powerman and Iron Fist. And by the way, Luke Cage, after he got out of prison, we talked about, and he did the whole marketing thing to become a superhero, renames himself Luke Cage because his name was Carl Lucas. He takes Luke from Carl Lucas from his last name. He takes Cage as a kind of homage to his time in prison, puts that together. You get the Luke Cage character. Like I said, it starts to lose steam as the 70s go on. And we get Powerman and Luke and Powerman and Iron Fist together to start kind of rebooting that title and rebooting that whole series. And we start to move into the 80s. Now, the 80s is a different era, right, Morris? We start thinking about things a little differently now. The 80s is often referred to as the me first decade because it's all about like opulence, and the yuppie culture comes out of that. And it's more about assimilation, I think, at this point, which is, I think, why Iron Fist and Power Man, which by the way, I'm sorry for going back, but I should have mentioned that after a while, when as the 70s go on, one of the things that Luke Cage does is he starts to work with like the Fantastic Four and the Avengers to kind of, assimilate himself, for a lack of a better term, because this is the era that we're going into. And he decides he needs a name, not Luke Cage, but a name more fitting to the superheroes that are in the Fantastic Four and the Avengers. And that's where the Power Man, he actually has to fight a guy named Eric for the Power Man title. He wins the Power Man title, and that's how he gets to be from Luke Cage to Power Man. It's a slight assimilation in my opinion. And I don't want to brush over that too quickly because, Mars, I want to hear what you think about that transition, because to me, it parallels us moving from the 70s into the 80s, where, Luke Cage represented kind of that blaxploitation icon that we talked about, but now we're moving into a more assimilated Luke Cage, right? And I think that's where we get the Power Man from.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, you look at some of the Miami Vice comes out of that, so you see a lot of like cop buddy kind of thing where there's one black cop and there's one white cop and that kind of thing. And so that's kind of a narrative that's threaded through popular culture at the time, and that kind of fit exactly what they were doing with that comic. And that's kind of a place where I actually lost a lot of interest in the comic, to be honest, during that period. It just kind of lost me at that point.
Yeah.
When you look at what's happening, you still can see that kind of I like the word assimilation, because it really was that. It really was trying to bring out of that swing that Black exploitation did cinematically, where it was this all Black kind of creation that, really delved in these problematic images to how does it fit into the bigger American landscape. And even like Iron Fist has his own problematic.
Yeah, he does.
The co-option of Asian culture
through
a white character, and that even went on to when they produced the film and the Netflix series and that kind of thing. It's like that had its own issues, but in terms of the Black culture, you really see that. So if you look at the 80s, right, and just think about it, the Cosby Show comes out in September of #84, which, to a lot of people was an assimilation show that it was an all Black show. It was, a different narrative as to Black people do these same things that white people do, but we do it in this cultural kind of aspect, right? And so it was really that kind of show. The other thing that's happening at the same time, though, Black culture is really starting to take a foothold in popular culture with music and rap music and that kind of thing. Absolutely. Is really coming onto the scene. And again, at that point, rap is specifically within Black culture. It's not played on the radio. It's not whatever. But and so I think that's where that aspect of what Black exploitation was trying to craft, that Black culture where we control the narrative and we control, the direction of the storylines. rap music started to be that space for that. And I think they were trying to thread that needle with Power Fist to really try to keep two audiences together and keep both of those characters, viable.
I agree. I agree. It was definitely about trying to keep them viable. It was definitely about that assimilation point. And I agree with your other point is this is where not only did the comic line start to lose you, but it started to lose me as well. And it started to actually lose its audience because September 1986, Powerman and Iron Fist 125 kind of signaled the end of that series. And actually at that point, Powerman basically for intents and purposes goes into hiding. And you see skirmishes of Powerman through some other titles, right? You see him up here in, some of the Avenger titles. You'll see him pop up in a Spider-Man issue. But for the most part, just like you said, that whole coming out of that blaxploitation, having assimilated, there wasn't a space for Luke Cage, for Powerman anymore. And I think the writers, at Marvel really struggled to find what's the hook for him now. So, like I said, you would see him kind of pop up here and there, but for the most part, you didn't see much until we start to move into the 90s. And like you said, this is where, Morris, I 100% agree with you. This is where coming mid 80s and especially coming into the 90s, right? Hip hop culture was like big for us. It was our political voice in a lot of times, right? It is what kind of almost defined our culture. And then, but there was this mix in the 90s of that, the brashness and of that political activism of like your hip hop culture and that type of thing. But there was also this big push of what I call multiculturalism, where the 80s was more about assimilation. If you think about it, the 90s was, we would say in the late 70s and early 80s that America is a melting pot. And then moving into the 90s, we started to say it was more like a soup pot, right? Where all of us existed together, but we did so in our individualness, right? It wasn't about all of us melding together. And so in the 90s is when you saw Powerman start to come back a little bit. You started to see him in more articles and then in more episodes, and Cage at that time. So we had Luke Cage, then we had Powerman and Iron Fist, and now Cage has his own title. Starting in April 1992, Cage #1 comes out. And if you go back and look at any of those album cover, of those comic covers, you will see where Luke Cage has made this transition from that kind of blaxploitation look, right, with the headband and the chains and all these, to this guy that now has a high top fade, right, in the 90s. And visually, you start to see him reflected what the 90s looked like. Credit to the artists and that type of thing that took a look at what Black culture looked like at the time and started to reflect that. But I think that, this is where I want to get your input, Mars, from a 90s standpoint, Luke Cage moved more from trying to assimilate to really standing on his own in a multicultural society.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really important about Luke Cage, and I know we talked about his mythology and his powers and whatnot, but to be a Black man and be virtually invulnerable and that kind of thing has its own mythology. Living in the United States has its own mythology. That's a good point. And I think the fact that you have white writers in the 80s, like that period you were talking about, they weren't tapped into the culture because there still was plenty of stuff to write about Luke Cage in there. You just started out in the 80s. They just started private prisons. They just started, things in terms of the drug law sentences that people started getting locked up on for really long stretches. All that stuff starts in that time frame. And if you were in the culture, if you were of the culture, you would have found some really interesting storylines to take Luke Cage into that. So that missing decade of Luke Cage, that 80s period, that was a missed opportunity. That was really where Black writers could have cultivated and curated a really interesting kind of character. But to your point, going to the 90s, and I think one of the things that I like to connect with the Luke Cage story is the fact that he was curated out as a Black man who was virtually invulnerable. And then you look at the 90s, March of 91, there's the Rodney King beatings and the ramifications of all that. In 95, you got the Million Man March, you know, and there's these elements of, again, the Black community engaged in popular culture in this really significant way. You know, that Rodney King beating captured the imagination of the country. It was finally the things that Black communities and Black people have been saying all along have been put on tape, you know, pre-cell phones and all that kind of thing. And so the way that Cage starts to evolve and starts to look, and his aesthetic is definitely a step in the direction that doesn't directly challenge that or talk about that, but it can no longer be that stereotypical, you know, got a business card without any kind of moral compass or any kind of cultural kind of relevance. So I think there was an effort to bring him further into a contemporary Black consciousness with some kind of moral compass, some kind of, you know, why he's a superhero, why he's, you know, has these powers and how he's going to use those.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that's one of the things that always troubled me about Luke Cage is what you're alluding to here. You know, when you think about it, Luke Cage was a bit of a quasi superhero, right? He had, of course, superhero powers, but he was never driven by a sense of a moral compass. Like you said, he never sought out to just do good in the world for the sake of doing good. If you think of Peter Parker, when he got bit by the spider, right? He realized he had these powers, but then he went out as a force for good. Batman over in the DC universe decided that, of course, it was, you know, as a result of the death of his parents, but he decided that he would be a force for good. Luke Cage was driven by the need to survive. First of all, that's where the whole hero for hire thing started. But then he was always driven by a sense of revenge, right? Because Stryker, his buddy that was started out with him in his original gang, you know, they had a rivalry between a girl that they both were going after, and she ended up getting killed. And so he blamed her for that. He loved her, and he was driven to get revenge on Stryker. It was always something that either connected him to the street or something that connected him to a sense of survival that drove him to do good as a byproduct. So I always was troubled a little bit that, you know, everybody else, it seemed like, did good for the sake of doing good, but we had to have either revenge or straight survival as a reason for doing that.
Yeah, that's exactly the underlying thread of what's problematic with Luke Cage, and that origin story and lack of a moral compass about why he was doing that. Because even like when in the storyline, this is, you know, delving into the comic a little bit, but how he has to steal off the Fantastic Four's vehicle to go find Dr. Doom to get his money. I mean, you know, it's like he goes find Dr. Doom because Dr. Doom owes him money for a work that he did for him, and that kind of thing. It's like there's a very, and you just don't see that in major characters in any other of the comics that you read about. It's never that basic or never that just kind of whatever. And they never took it in terms of him being of the community, and that begins to be his work. You don't see that until maybe you start looking at the Netflix series and that kind of thing, but you never saw that in a comic to where he was integrated into the community or the culture, and that became his viable way of being a superhero kind of thing.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and so it's the Achilles heel of the entire thing. As much as he's iconic, as much as he's, you know, that established kind of figure, that is the Achilles heel of his whole character.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things that I think we would be remiss in not mentioning, you know, we talked about how, especially in his fledgling times, that he had ties into other characters. And by the way, along the runs, there have been several heroes for hire titles, right? And there were some that didn't include Luke Cage. And you think about, you know, Misty Knight and all other people were involved in the whole heroes for hire kind of storyline. But one thing I wanted to bring out that I made sure we touched on is, you know, talking about touches to other characters, was his connection with Jessica Jones. Right? So she, of course, had about the same powers that he had. She had self-healing, super strong, that type of thing. But I found it really interesting how they tied in together. And I think, there were, and I've done some research to find out, who was actually the first interracial superhero couple. Yeah. And there have been several, by the way, and I think that they might have been the actual first couple tied together. And so I invite some of our listeners to definitely, join us on social media to tell us if you found any other instances. There are definitely been other interracial couples. They might have been the first. What I did find out was Iron Fist and Misty Knight were the first interracial couple to share a kiss in a comic. And there's this panel that when they actually kissed in that comic, Luke was there and he was like, man, y'all come on, we got things to do. We got to go. We got bad guys to catch, And so there was never a confrontation about that, which was kind of cool. But the whole Jessica Jones tie in and, the fact that we were becoming in, like I said, mid 80s into the 90s, becoming more multicultural, interracial relationships were becoming more mainstream and more accepted as well. So much so that they even had a baby together, right?
Yeah, they had a family. And I think and I'm not as familiar with the Jessica Jones comic, but I watched the Netflix series. And one of the things that actually that really integrated well too was a feminist lens in terms of the narrative of the Purple Man and the control of Jessica Jones, and that really speaking to patriarchy and male domination over females and that kind of thing. And so that was a really interesting universe to kind of explore. And like I said, I kind of saw that through the Netflix series, not necessarily through the comics, but I would have liked to see that same kind of like interesting villain relationship with how Luke Cage was developed, or how Luke Cage's opposition was really structural in that it was with the prison system. Because again, it goes back to that Luke Cage never fought against the prison. Once he escaped, he escaped. And once he was in the community, he was in the community, and you never saw him engage with a structure that was an oppressive kind of structure. And I think that Jessica Jones tie-in with the Purple Man, and at some point, I think he threatens Luke Cage and that kind of thing. There was that interesting tie-in that on a feminist lens really spoke well to that. I would have liked to see that same kind of narrative played out, on a racial lens, with the Luke Cage character.
Yeah, and what I will say, I will give Marvel credit, in the actual comic series, that relationship is a lot deeper than even the Netflix series. Purple Man, so Purple Man does do all kind of stuff to try to interfere with their relationship. But they had their, and it's a really interesting line, because when Jessica in the actual comic series, when Jessica first got pregnant, she thought maybe it was Ant-Man's baby, and then find out that there was Luke's baby. Also, there was a whole lot of like Maury Povich drama going on. It was a really interesting line, and they had a lot of problems in their relationship. One of the things, to Marvel's credit as well, is even with the Purple Man's, interfering and all the trouble he caused, they stuck it out. They had literal couple arguments through some of the comic series, but they managed to stick it out. It's probably one of the better handled dialogues or storylines that I have seen, especially when you talk about a couple dynamic. Because as we talked about in an earlier episode of Superheroes in Color, Black Panther and Storm couldn't stay together, right? Right. They couldn't. But Luke Cage and Jessica Jones found a way thus far to and I think they've been married over 10 years now in the comic world. So they managed to stick it out.
Let me ask you this in terms of both of those characters as well. One of the things I found interesting, I want to get your take on it too, is that they truly didn't have like a secret identity, right? They were who they were 24/7 kind of thing. And that was an interesting kind of take. I don't know if Marvel had established that there were other characters like that, or these were the first characters that really were these kind of people struggling in the world. Because Jessica Jones drinks and all that kind of stuff. So you really get into an element to where there is no secret identity for these people, and they are just stuck, being who they are, in the world as super beings almost.
Yeah, it was almost that's a good point. It was almost a necessary part, because remember, they were all heroes for hire. right? And so Luke, early on, like we said, he marketed himself as, you can pay me for my superhero powers.
Yeah.
So part of that, being able to market yourself was on for doing. Yeah. So you're right. They never, which on the flip side of that, Morris, is a great point that you made earlier about, being a superhero out of a sense of a moral compass or out of a sense of survival or even revenge, right? A superhero for hire concept has really nothing to do with I'm doing good for the sake of good. It's I'm doing good for profit or I'm doing good for revenge, one of those two. So, and that, I guess you have to have, maybe to develop that story right, to be a hero for hire. Maybe it takes a tortured soul to have to pull that off, right?
Right.
It's a great point, but I think part of their lack of secret identity was out of necessity for what their characters were.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense.
Yeah. So moving forward through the 2000s, we got the Jessica Jones time. We got her Luke Cage married with a baby, and Luke Cage is kind of up and down throughout the rest, moving all the way up until kind of current time. There are some mini runs, I will call them, that came out in 2002. Marvel, and probably prior to this, I don't know when the actual Marvel Max label started, but in 2002, Luke Cage showed up in the Marvel Max label, and Marvel Max was a label that Marvel did with adult themed content. So all of the Marvel Max came with that explicit content warning, like you did on, CDs and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of those covers, those Marvel Max covers, each one of those 5 cover lines. And one of the things we invite you to do definitely is, when we can, is to get to the library, because we have all of these titles in the collection at the library, at the Auburn Avenue Research Library. Definitely take a look at those, or even invite you to look at them online. Those covers are the height of stereotype. So if you look at, I think number 1, Luke had a pair of brass knuckles on, and one of the issues there was Luke with a gold grill, man, a set of gold teeth that spell out Cage across the front. And the brass knuckles spell out Cage. Either they were brass knuckles, or, remember back in the day we had those 4-finger rings? It was one of the two. I don't know which one it was.
Right.
But those were the height of stereotype of that era. This is early 2000s, that whole hip hop culture type stereotypes, misogynistic, violent, the violent side of hip hop. Those were, so, like I said, we had some skirmishes up through the 2000s with things like this. But one of the things that Morris, and it goes back to our Sweet Christmas tie-in, right? And the catchphrase. There was and there's 2 more kind of runs that I want to touch on with you. That Sweet Christmas, every season, Marvel puts out what they call their annual. And there was a Sweet Christmas annual that popped up with Powerman Iron Fist, that took on Krampus, right? The kind of Santa Claus looking Christmas demon, man. Right. And to me, it just smacked of grabbing at straws, right? We're trying to do something to keep
Yeah.
So my question is, and this is kind of to bring everything you said thus far full circle, is how, with proper representation, Morris, how do you treat Luke Cage that he makes an impact to make some type of statement, right? Without, maybe some of the stereotypes are necessary to break through media. Fine, I'll give you some of that. But what do you do? What are your thoughts? What do you do with Luke Cage to move some of this problematic stuff and use that platform you have and that opportunity you have to bring some messages forward?
Yeah, I think the Netflix series, even though there were some problematic issues with that, I think they really made an honest effort to reform Luke Cage's image in terms of, he was definitely webbed within the Black culture of Harlem. He definitely still was not kind of an agent of his own action. He was it was forced upon him to, even in the series, to, engage in the fight and that kind of thing. But I think putting him in context with the Black community and with the issues of gentrification, with some of those larger issues that were happening, was a step in the right direction. Because I think there's a lot of stuff there. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there in terms of the conversation about incarceration, the conversation about the Black experience with the legal system. Even if you want to trouble his, using his superpowers to, just make money, I don't think it was done in like an intellectually kind of honest way. It was done kind of just in this kind of cheap way, that's what a brother would do. If he had superpowers, he would just, worry about, how he's going to eat and how he's going to pay the rent, but not in a way that was like, him trying to figure out, what I should truly be doing, with this extraordinary power. And symbolically, I would love to see how the world will react to a Black man who's virtually invulnerable, that cannot be hurt, what would be the true experience of somebody like that living in the world in the United States in this kind of authentic kind of way, given, like you said, we go into the 20s and we talking about the shooting of Trayvon Martin. At the same time, we also talking about the election of the, first Black president, of the United States, and start to use those kind of parallels to have this conversation within the Luke Cage universe would really be interesting, would really be something that I think would definitely tie into a larger conversation when you talk about the new Jim Crow, when you talk about, some of those things that are really important to the Black community. And it's troublesome that we go full circle. We, like you said, you took us through all these decades, and then we just end up with the Max, the Marvel Max, we end up with a much more glossy, sophisticated stereotype that harkens right back to the very beginning of when we started, in 1970.
Yes, that is such a great encapsulation. So, I want to just start to wrap up here by agreeing with you that even though Luke Cage was, a breakthrough moment in the Black comic universe, it also, and I think we would agree with this, Morris, it also was an opportunity lost, right? Because you had so many things that could have been accomplished with this character. And granted, not everything has to be political grandstanding, right? We don't some things we could do just for the entertainment value. I get that. But here's the thing. If you are going to bring out a part of a culture, then you become responsible, in my opinion, for bringing out all of the ins and outs of it that you can. So you took on a responsibility when you brought Luke Cage forward and you decided, I want to give this Black character his own line. Given the climate and given the way that you portrayed him, you, Marvel, were then responsible for taking advantage of everything that came along with it, right? And I just think that was an opportunity missed. Just want to see if you agree with that.
Exactly. Yeah. And like you said, too, I think the other thing with Marvel, where, I'm not sure what those later volumes look like, but you have a definite obligation to bring in artists and writers of the culture that really can inform these characters and reboot these characters in a really natural way. And even given like that, I would love to see people, because you and I read the swath of comics. I would love to have people read the Luke Cages and see that imagery, but read it in context with Brother Man comic, and really, see some juxtapositions where you can really start to identify when a comic is created out of the culture and within the culture. You'll see some parallels between the two, but you will definitely see where the breakout and where the authentic representation of the culture comes out. And I can't wait till we have that conversation, a full episode, Brother Man. So that's a whole universe unto itself that deserves something. And there's one other thing I wanted to mention. Let me grab it real quick. This is a comic I found. I don't know if this is in the collection, but it's Race to Incarcerate. And it's about the incarceration, and Michelle Alexander wrote the foreword in it. I found this at a thrift shop, here in the city. And it's a powerful graphic novel that just does a wonderful job of talking about incarceration with statistics and that kind of thing. And again, that would be a great parallel to go through the Powerman and Luke Cage comics with this kind of contextual information in the same format and still a graphic novel format, that would be amazing to use as a balance against what you read within a historical context with Luke Cage.
That's a great time. We'll definitely include some information about Race to Incarcerate in the newsletter. So encourage everybody to go to our website, superheroesincolor.com. Subscribe to the newsletter, and Morris, we'll put some information about Race to Incarcerate in that as well.
Definitely.
Great. Well, Morris, as always, it has been such a blast talking to you. Thank you for your time. Again, Merry Christmas to you, brother. Happy New Year. The other thing I want to, as always, we wrap up our Superheroes in Color episodes with a little thing we call What Say You? So Marvel, over its, I don't know how many years they've been doing this, quite honestly, but they run periodically a title called What If. And what they do is they reimagine some characters in some what if situations. For example, there is a story that asks, what if Powerman were a woman? There's even a storyline that asks, what if Powerman was white? In which they reimagine his storylines through the lens of white America. It is hokey and corny and kind of funny, but it is definitely, if you can dig that out, check out that what if storyline. So in our What Say You, to wrap things up, Morris, my question is, what if Luke Cage or Powerman were a hip hop artist? Who would he most be like?
Oh, wow.
And I intentionally didn't give you this ahead of time to put you on the spot.
Yeah, that's pretty deep, man, because it's like there's a couple that come off easily to mind.
Okay.
I really wish he would be more like a Chuck D kind of figure.
Yes.
I mean, that's the idyllic Powerman,
Yes.
Public Enemy had that classic song, Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos.
Yeah.
Whole song about a prison break.
Yes.
That's my ideal, Luke Cage that's embodied in the Chuck D, mythos of what Public Enemy actually did. I would love to see that, but maybe more realistically, he looks like I don't know. I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
Chuck D is a good one, man.
I
didn't think about
I would love to see that. Yeah,
that is awesome.
I'm gonna stick with my ideal version of what I think Powerman would be. I think if he was written out of the culture and out of his experience, I think he'd be much reflective of a S1W.
Yes, that is dope.
Yeah.
I love that one. I was not, and of course I had privy to this question already, so I thought about it a little bit, but I am like a little intimidated now because Chuck D was such a good answer, man. But I think mine would be Mos Def, right? Because Mos Def is now, and again, this is not who he reflected, because if we said who he actually reflected, it would be somebody like quasi-political, kind of watered down, maybe like a Heavy D or something like that. But if we were talking about what I would like to see, it would be like a Mos Def who has this just way of expressing things. Because Powerman tried, his catchphrases, right. All his little corny dialogue, but Mos Def to me has this articulate way of expressing things, of reflecting where we are and reflecting the culture. So if I had to pick one, that's who I'd like to see him.
Yeah, that's the reboot, man. You rebooted up.
There you go.
From there, yeah.
So that's what's up. So, we're all about representation, and that's one of our big things, right? So, Marvel, if you're out there listening, we got some representation for Luke Cage.
Exactly, yeah.
That's right. Well, brother, again, it's been, as always, an absolute pleasure talking to you. So look forward to the next one. Just to remind everybody that we are on social media at SHIC Social, everywhere, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, SHIC Social. Join us there. Come to superheroesincolor.com. You get the show notes. You get the links to all the podcasts to re-listen to the wonderful insights from my co-host here. And you can also sign up for our newsletter where we'll put more information about the things that we've talked about. So thank you. Look forward to the next episode. And until then, keep reading, fam.